Montana Territory, 1880. Smoke curled from the chimneys of White Ridge as the afternoon sun bathed the dusty main street in golden light. The town hummed with anticipation for the wedding set to take place at the white-clapboard church perched on the hill. Nearly everyone in the small frontier settlement had gathered to witness Katherine Jenkins become Mrs. Theodore Montgomery. Everyone except for Flynn Galloway, who had no interest in watching another man claim the woman whose smile had haunted his dreams since she'd arrived on the westbound stage 3 months prior. Flynn believed the frontier was a place where a man stood alone. At 25, he'd already seen how the harsh realities of the West could tear at the seams of even the strongest bonds. A cowboy's only true companions are his horse and the open sky. His father had told him before bleeding out from a rustler's bullet when Flynn was just 16. The lesson had sunk deep into his bones. Attachments were dangerous out here where death lurked behind every canyon wall and drought season. He tightened the cinch on his chestnut gelding outside the livery, preparing for a long ride to check the northern fence line of the struggling ranch he'd inherited. The work would keep his mind occupied while the town celebrated. The cattle business had been tough lately, with prices falling and the larger spreads pushing smaller operations like his toward bankruptcy. Flynn had convinced himself that focusing solely on survival was the only option. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a distraction that could cost him everything. "Thought you might be at the church with the others," said Harvey, the aging livery owner, as he emerged from the shadowy barn. "Got fence to mend," Flynn replied curtly, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. Harvey leaned against a post, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw. "Heard Montgomery's got himself a pretty bride. That Eastern gal with the golden hair." Flynn's jaw tightened. "Miss Jenkins will make a fine wife for a banker." He swung into the saddle, eager to escape the conversation and the town. "Supposing she shows up," Harvey muttered. Flynn paused, one hand on the reins. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, nothing." Harvey waved dismissively. "Just that sometimes folks get cold feet, is all." Flynn rode out of town with a strange unease settling in his chest. He told himself it didn't matter if Katherine Jenkins became Katherine Montgomery by sundown. He had a ranch to save and winter preparations to make. Love was for people with easier lives than his. The sound of hoofbeats on the trail behind him pulled Flynn from his thoughts as he reached the edge of town. He turned in the saddle, squinting against the sun, and nearly fell off his horse at the sight. Katherine Jenkins was galloping toward him, her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner caught in the wind. She wore her wedding dress, yards of white satin now splattered with dust and sweat from her desperate ride. At 22, she was breathtakingly beautiful, even with tears streaking her flushed cheeks. Her horse, clearly borrowed in haste, seemed as desperate as she was, its eyes wild as Katherine pushed it harder. "Flynn," she called out, her voice breaking. "Flynn, wait." He reined in his gelding, too stunned to do anything but stare as she approached. This was the woman who was supposed to be standing at the altar right now, not racing away from town in her wedding finery. "Katherine, what in heaven's name?" "I couldn't do it," she gasped, pulling her lathered mount to a stop beside him. Her blue eyes, the color of Montana's summer sky, were wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "I stood there in the church vestibule, listening to the organ playing, and I just knew I couldn't marry him." Flynn's heart hammered in his chest. "The whole town's waiting for you. Let them wait forever." She lifted her chin defiantly, though her hands trembled on the reins. "Theodore doesn't love me. He loves the idea of having a well-bred Eastern wife to complete his frontier banking empire. And her voice faltered, "I don't love him either." This was madness. Flynn glanced back toward town, half expecting to see an angry posse of wedding guests in pursuit. "Katherine, you can't just—" "I can and I have." There was steel beneath the silk of her voice now. "I won't sell myself into a loveless marriage just because my father arranged it to settle his debts with Theodore's bank." The revelation struck Flynn like a physical blow. "Your father arranged the marriage?" Katherine nodded, fighting back fresh tears. "After Mother died last year, the medical debts nearly ruined him. Theodore offered to forgive everything if I agreed to be his wife." She looked away, her profile sharp against the afternoon sky. "I thought I could do it, for Father's sake. But standing there today, I realized I'd be betraying myself. And," she hesitated, meeting Flynn's eyes with sudden intensity, betraying my heart. Flynn's throat went dry. This couldn't be happening. Katherine Jenkins, with her refined Eastern education and delicate manners, had no place in his hardscrabble existence. Yet here she was, choosing freedom over security, the unknown over certainty. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't know." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. "Away from here. Perhaps to Helena, or even California." The thought of her alone on the trail, vulnerable to every danger the frontier could present, sent a cold shiver down Flynn's spine. Before he could think better of it, he said, "You can't travel alone. It's not safe. I have no choice." "You have me," Flynn said, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise her. "At least until you figure out where you're headed." The relief that washed over Katherine's face pierced through years of carefully constructed defenses. Something fundamental shifted inside Flynn as he realized that, for the first time since his father's death, he was choosing connection over isolation. "We should get moving," he said, nodding toward the hills. "They'll be looking for you soon." As they rode together toward his ranch, Flynn felt as though he'd stepped off a cliff without knowing if there was ground below. All he knew was that Katherine Jenkins had just upended every conviction he held about surviving on the frontier. The sun was setting by the time they reached Flynn's modest ranch house nestled in a protected valley between rocky ridges. The two-room cabin was plain but solid, built by his father's hands 15 years earlier. A small barn stood nearby, with corrals for the horses and the few dozen head of cattle that constituted Flynn's struggling herd. "It's not much," Flynn said as he helped Katherine dismount, acutely aware of how her wedding dress contrasted with the rustic surroundings. "It's beautiful," she replied, taking in the panoramic view of mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. "So peaceful compared to town." Flynn led her inside, hastily lighting a lamp and stoking the embers in the stone fireplace. The single room served as kitchen and living area, with a doorway leading to his small bedroom. Everything was utilitarian, nothing like the fine home she would have shared with Montgomery. "You can take the bedroom," Flynn said, not meeting her eyes. "I'll sleep out here." Katherine stood in the center of the room, suddenly looking small and lost in her wedding dress. "I've put you in a terrible position," she said quietly. "They'll think you helped me run away." Flynn hadn't considered that possibility, but she was right. Theodore Montgomery was an influential man with connections throughout the territory. If he believed Flynn had stolen his bride, let them think what they want, Flynn said with more confidence than he felt. "You made your choice. I'm just helping a friend in need." Katherine's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Are we friends, Flynn Galloway?" The question hung between them, laden with possibilities neither dared name. "I'd like to think so," he answered carefully. "Even though I'm just another attachment that could bring you pain?" The directness of her question startled him. "People talk, Flynn. I've heard how you keep to yourself since your father died." Flynn turned away, busying himself with preparing a simple meal. The frontier's not kind to those who don't stay vigilant. And is vigilance worth the loneliness? Her voice was gentle, not accusing. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching riders broke the evening stillness. Flynn moved to the window, peering through the gathering darkness. "3 riders," he said grimly. "Coming fast." Katherine paled. "Theodore." Flynn grabbed his rifle from above the door. "Stay inside. No matter what happens, stay inside." He stepped onto the porch just as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. The lead rider was indeed Theodore Montgomery, his wedding suit now covered in trail dust, his normally composed banker's face twisted with rage. "Galloway," he shouted, not dismounting. "I know she's here." Flynn stood his ground, rifle held casually but ready. "Evening, Montgomery. This is private property." "Where is she?" Theodore demanded, the 2 men flanking him, his younger brother and the town deputy, shifting nervously in their saddles. "I don't know who you're talking about," Flynn replied evenly. Theodore's face flushed dangerously. "Katherine Jenkins is my bride. We have a contract, and her father's debts are still very much alive if she fails to honor it." "Sounds like a business arrangement, not a marriage," Flynn observed. "This isn't your concern, Cowboy," Theodore snarled. "Step aside. We're taking her back to town." Flynn didn't move. "No woman on my property is being taken anywhere against her will." The standoff stretched for several tense heartbeats before the cabin door opened behind Flynn. Katherine stepped out, her chin high despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I'm not going back, Theodore," she said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Theodore's face contorted with fury. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire town. Your father will lose everything." "My father would never want me to sell myself, even to save him," Katherine replied, her voice stronger now. "The contract was your idea, not his." "You'll regret this," Theodore warned, his gaze shifting between Katherine and Flynn. "Both of you. No one crosses me in this territory." He jerked his horse around. "You have until noon tomorrow to reconsider, Katherine. After that, your father's note comes due in full." The three men rode off, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Flynn lowered his rifle, his mind racing. Montgomery had the power to make good on his threats, to ruin Katherine's father, and potentially drive Flynn's struggling ranch into bankruptcy if he chose to call in loans or turn the cattle buyers against him. "I should go," Katherine said quietly. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Flynn turned to her, seeing the guilt etched on her face. "Trouble finds its way to every doorstep out here eventually," he said. "At least this trouble is worth facing." Katherine's eyes widened slightly at his words. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the path forward, however dangerous, would be walked together. That night, as Flynn lay on a bedroll near the fireplace, he found himself more awake than he'd felt in years. The woman sleeping in his bed represented everything he'd told himself to avoid: complication, vulnerability, the risk of devastating loss. Yet for the first time since burying his father, the ranch felt like more than just land and livestock. It felt like it might become a home. Morning brought new challenges. Flynn rose before dawn to find Katherine already awake, dressed in some of his smallest clothes, a shirt and trousers that hung loosely on her slender frame. She'd bound her golden hair back with a strip of fabric torn from her wedding dress, which lay folded on a chair. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the clothes. "I can hardly work in a wedding gown." "Work? If I'm staying here, even temporarily, I intend to earn my keep." There was a determination in her voice that brooked no argument. "I may have been raised in Philadelphia, but I'm not helpless." Flynn watched with surprise as Katherine proved her words over the following days. She tackled every task with the same resolve that had driven her from the altar: feeding chickens, helping repair fence lines, even learning to gentle the half-wild Mustang Flynn had recently captured. She was no stranger to hard work, having helped manage her father's household after her mother's passing. As they worked side by side, Flynn found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about his father's dreams for the ranch, the drought that had nearly ruined them 3 years ago, even the lonely Christmases he'd spent since becoming the ranch's sole occupant. Katherine, in turn, told him of her life back east, of her passion for books and learning, and of the gradual decline of her family's fortunes that had led to her father's desperate arrangement with Montgomery. "I used to believe security was worth any sacrifice," she confessed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains. "That's why I agreed to marry Theodore initially." "What changed?" Flynn asked. Katherine looked at him, her blue eyes reflecting the golden light. "I realized there are different kinds of security. Financial security means nothing without the freedom to follow your heart." Flynn felt something inside him shift, like ice breaking up on a spring river. The walls he'd built around himself since his father's death seemed suddenly flimsy and unnecessary. But reality intruded the next morning when a rider approached. Not Montgomery or his men, but Katherine's father, James Jenkins. The older man looked haggard, his normally dignified bearing bent with worry as Flynn and Katherine met him outside the cabin. "Katherine," he breathed, dismounting stiffly. "Thank God you're safe." Katherine rushed to embrace her father. "I'm sorry for worrying you," she said, "but I couldn't go through with it." Mr. Jenkins held his daughter at arm's length, his expression grave. "Montgomery is foreclosing on our property in town. We have 3 days to vacate or pay the note in full." Flynn watched the color drain from Katherine's face. "But that's impossible. We don't have that kind of money." "I know." Mr. Jenkins sighed heavily. "Which is why I've come to bring you back. If you agree to marry him, he'll tear up the debt." "No." Katherine stepped back, shaking her head. "I won't do it. There must be another way." Flynn cleared his throat. "How much is the note, sir?" Mr. Jenkins named a sum that made Flynn wince inwardly. more than he could possibly raise in 3 days, even if he sold half his herd. Perhaps we could negotiate an extension, Flynn suggested, thinking rapidly. Or find another investor to buy the note from Montgomery. Montgomery's made sure no one in town will touch it, Mr. Jenkins said bitterly. He wants Katherine, not money. As they discussed possibilities, none of them noticed the rider approaching from the east until he was nearly upon them. The man was trail-worn but sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Excuse me," he called as he rode up. "I'm looking for Flynn Galloway." Flynn stepped forward cautiously. "That's me." The rider, a weathered man in his 50s, dismounted and extended his hand. "Name's Marcus Ellsworth. I've been tracking you down for nearly a month. What business do you have with me?" Flynn asked, shaking the man's hand warily. Ellsworth reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sealed envelope. "I represent the estate of Robert Galloway." Flynn froze. "My Uncle Robert? I haven't seen him since I was a boy." "Your uncle passed away 3 months ago in California," Ellsworth explained. "Gold country made him rich beyond his dreams. Having no children of his own, he left everything to his only nephew." Flynn accepted the envelope with numb fingers, breaking the seal to find legal documents and a letter. As he read, his expression shifted from shock to disbelief. "Is this real?" he asked hoarsely. Ellsworth nodded. "Every word. Your Uncle Robert left you his entire fortune, nearly $50,000 in gold and bank drafts, plus mining interests still producing revenue." The news hit like a thunderbolt. Flynn had been struggling to save his ranch, counting every penny, worrying about making it through another winter, and all this time, a fortune had been searching for him. Katherine touched his arm gently. "Flynn." He looked up from the papers, meeting her eyes. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Mr. Jenkins looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "What does this mean?" Flynn made a decision in that moment, one that would have been unthinkable to him just weeks before. "It means, sir, that I'd like to make Montgomery an offer for your debt." And then, he glanced at Katherine, his heart racing. "If your daughter is willing, I'd like to court her properly." Katherine's eyes widened, hope blooming across her face. "Flynn." "I know it's sudden," he continued, taking her hands in his. "And I know I'm just a rancher, not a banker or a businessman. But these past days with you have shown me what I've been missing all these years. I thought surviving alone was strength, but I was wrong. Real strength is having the courage to let someone in, even knowing what you might lose." The transformation on the ranch over the following month was remarkable. With his unexpected inheritance, Flynn paid off Mr. Jenkins' debt to Montgomery in full, much to the banker's barely concealed fury. Katherine's father moved into the small bunkhouse on the property, while Flynn employed local men to expand the main house, adding rooms and comforts that transformed the bachelor's cabin into a proper home. But the greatest transformation was in Flynn himself. The young man who had once believed that isolation was the only safe path on the frontier now found himself planning for a future that included not just Katherine, but a community. He hired hands to expand his cattle operation, invested in the struggling general store in town to ensure its survival, and even donated funds to rebuild the schoolhouse that had been damaged in last year's flood. Through it all, Katherine remained by his side, her practical nature and quick mind proving invaluable as they worked together to build something neither had dared dream of before. Her father, relieved of his financial burdens, discovered a talent for ranching that surprised everyone, including himself. The courtship that Flynn had promised was conducted with proper respect for tradition, despite the unconventional beginning. They rode together across the expanding ranch, picnicked beside mountain streams, and spent evenings reading aloud from Katherine's beloved books by the fireplace. With each passing day, the connection between them deepened from initial attraction into something more profound, a partnership forged in mutual respect and growing love. Yet shadows still loomed. Theodore Montgomery had not forgiven the public humiliation of being left at the altar, nor the loss of control over the Jenkins family's fate. Rumors spread through town that he was looking for ways to undermine Flynn's new ventures, whispering to cattle buyers about the inexperience of the young rancher and questioning the legitimacy of his sudden wealth. The confrontation came on a crisp autumn day when Flynn rode into town to finalize the purchase of additional grazing land. Montgomery was waiting outside the land office, flanked by two men Flynn didn't recognize. "Quite the empire you're building, Galloway," Montgomery called as Flynn dismounted. "Pity it's built on sand." Flynn tied his horse to the hitching post, keeping his voice level. "I have no quarrel with you, Montgomery. But I have one with you," the banker replied, stepping closer. "You stole what was mine." "Katherine was never yours," Flynn said, his temper rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "She's not property to be bargained for." Montgomery's face darkened. "My investors from back east arrive next week. They were promised a certain image, a respectable banker with a cultured wife, not a humiliated bachelor undercut by some lucky cowboy. Your investors will judge you on your banking skills, not your marital status," Flynn pointed out. "Perhaps." Montgomery smiled coldly. "But they might be interested to know that the Galloway Ranch's sudden prosperity comes from gold that doesn't legally belong to you." Flynn went still. "What are you talking about?" Montgomery produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "Your Uncle Robert had a partner in his mining operation, a partner who claims he was cheated out of his share. He signed over his right to pursue that claim to me." The threat hung in the air between them. Even if the claim was baseless, the legal fight could drain Flynn's resources and reputation just as he was establishing himself. "This is a bluff," Flynn said, though doubt crept into his mind. He knew nothing about his uncle's business dealings. "Try me," Montgomery challenged. "Or we could come to an arrangement. Convince Katherine to honor her original commitment to me, and these papers disappear." The rage that surged through Flynn was unlike anything he'd felt before. Not for his own sake, but for Katherine's, that this man still thought he could treat her like a commodity to be traded. "Never," Flynn growled. "File your claim. Take me to court. Do your worst. Katherine makes her own choices, and she chose to walk away from you." Montgomery's face contorted with fury. "You'll regret this, Galloway. By Christmas, you'll be back to being a struggling rancher with nothing but debt to your name." As Montgomery stormed away, Flynn stood frozen. The future he'd been building with Katherine suddenly threatened. His old instincts screamed at him. This is what happens when you let yourself care, when you build something worth losing. When Flynn returned to the ranch that evening, he couldn't bring himself to tell Katherine about Montgomery's threat. She was on the porch, golden hair catching the sunset as she sketched plans for the garden she wanted to plant in spring. The sight of her, so at home, so full of hope for their future, made his throat tighten with fear of losing everything they'd started to build. "Flynn." Katherine set aside her paper as he approached, immediately sensing his tension. "What's wrong?" He forced a smile. "Nothing. Just tired." But as the days passed, Flynn grew increasingly distant, throwing himself into ranch work from dawn until well after dusk, making preparations as if for a siege. He began liquidating some investments, securing cash reserves, behaving like a man battening down for a storm. Katherine watched with growing concern until one evening, as November winds rattled the windows, she confronted him in his study where he sat reviewing paperwork. "You're pulling away," she said simply, standing in the doorway. "And I deserve to know why." Flynn looked up at her, the woman who had changed everything for him, and felt the weight of his silence like a physical burden. "I'm trying to protect what we're building," he said finally. "By shutting me out." Katherine entered the room fully now, her eyes reflecting hurt and confusion. "That's not protection, Flynn. That's fear." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. He was retreating to his old belief that the only way to survive was alone, that caring too much was dangerous. "Montgomery is threatening to take everything," he admitted finally, explaining about the alleged mining partner and the legal claim. "He could tie us up in court for years. We could lose it all. The ranch, the investments, everything we've planned." Katherine listened quietly, her expression shifting from hurt to understanding and then to determination. When Flynn finished, she moved around the desk and took his hands in hers. "Do you know what I realized the day I ran from that church?" she asked. "That safety isn't found in bank accounts or social standing. It's found in being true to yourself and in having someone beside you who sees you clearly and stays anyway." Flynn looked up at her, this remarkable woman who had appeared in his life like an unexpected sunrise. "I can't bear the thought of failing you, of losing everything I wanted to give you." "The only thing I need from you is your heart, Flynn Galloway," Katherine said softly. "Everything else, we'll face together." For the first time in weeks, Flynn felt the tightness in his chest begin to ease. Katherine was right. He'd been falling back into old patterns, trying to shoulder burdens alone that were meant to be shared. Together, then, he agreed, drawing her into his arms. The next morning brought unexpected news. Mr. Jenkins burst into the house, waving a newspaper from Helena. "You need to see this," he said, spreading the paper on the table. The headline read, "Banking Scandal Rocks Territory, Prominent Banker Flees." The article detailed how Theodore Montgomery had been embezzling from his own bank for years, using false loans and manipulated books to maintain the appearance of prosperity while secretly funneling funds to speculation ventures that had failed spectacularly. When bank examiners arrived unexpectedly, he had fled in the night, leaving behind a trail of fraudulent documents. "Montgomery's gone," Mr. Jenkins said, amazement in his voice. His threats were empty because he knew he was about to be exposed. The relief that washed over Flynn was profound. The shadow that had been hanging over their future had lifted as suddenly as it had appeared. Katherine squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with vindication and relief. "It seems the universe has a sense of justice after all," she said softly. With Montgomery's threat removed, Flynn and Katherine turned their attention back to building their life together. As December arrived, bringing the first heavy snows of winter, the expanded ranch house was finally completed, a warm, welcoming home large enough for family, yet intimate enough to feel cozy during the long Montana winters. Christmas approached, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Flynn found himself looking forward to the holiday with anticipation rather than dread. The house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, filling the rooms with the scent of the forest. Katherine had insisted on a proper Christmas celebration, inviting not just her father, but also the ranch hands and several families from town who had fallen on hard times after Montgomery's bank collapsed. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside the windows, Flynn found Katherine in the parlor, arranging small gifts beneath the tree they had cut from the North Ridge. The lamplight caught in her hair, creating a golden halo effect that made his heart skip. "Katherine," he said softly, drawing her attention. When she turned, he was already kneeling, a small box in his hand. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Her eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a ring with a modestly sized diamond flanked by two sapphires that matched her eyes. "I never believed I could find home in another person," Flynn said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I thought the frontier demanded isolation, that connections were weaknesses rather than strengths. You showed me how wrong I was." Tears glistened in Katherine's eyes as Flynn continued. "When you ran from that church all those months ago, you were running toward the truth, that love can't be bartered or arranged, only freely given. And I want to freely give you my heart, my name, my future, everything I am or ever will be." He took a deep breath. "Katherine Jenkins, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she extended her hand. "1,000 times yes." As Flynn slipped the ring onto her finger, he felt the last of his old defenses crumble away. The man who had once believed that frontier survival meant standing alone now understood that true strength came from standing together. The wedding took place on New Year's Day, 1881, in the same church Katherine had fled months earlier. But this time, when she walked down the aisle in a simple gown of ivory silk, her face glowed with genuine joy. Flynn waited at the altar, clean-shaven and handsome in his new suit, looking at her as though she were the sunrise after the longest night. As they exchanged vows, Flynn thought of the journey that had brought them here, how Katherine's courage in leaving a safe but loveless match had led them both to a richer life than either could have imagined. The frontier was still harsh, still dangerous, but facing it together made all the difference. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers outside the church, Flynn leaned close to whisper in his new wife's ear. "Montgomery's loss truly was my forever gain," he said softly. "And I intend to spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret choosing this cowboy over a banker." Katherine's laughter rang out, bright and clear in the winter air. "The best choice I ever made was running away that day," she replied, squeezing his hand. "And the best place I ever ran to was your side." As they drove away in the sleigh decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, The townspeople of White Ridge watched the young couple begin their new life together. The frontier had taught Flynn Galloway that a man needed to stand alone to survive, but Katherine had shown him a greater truth, that a life truly worth living was one shared with someone you love. By the following Christmas, the Galloway Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory, not just because of Flynn's inheritance, but because of the partnership that had transformed both the land and the people who worked it. The house that had once stood empty and silent now rang with laughter and conversation. And when spring arrived, bringing new calves to the growing herd, it also brought another blessing: the news that by autumn, the Galloway family would welcome its newest member. Standing on the porch one evening as summer approached, Flynn wrapped his arms around Katherine, his hands resting gently on her growing belly. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the valley in gold and shadow. "Are you happy?" he asked, still sometimes amazed that this life was truly his. Katherine leaned back against him, her hands covering his. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she answered. "This is what home feels like." Flynn pressed a kiss to her temple, thinking of how close he had come to missing all of this, how his fear of connection had nearly cost him everything that now gave his life meaning. The frontier was still the frontier, with all its dangers and uncertainties, but he faced it now with an open heart, knowing that true strength wasn't found in isolation but in the courage to love fully, whatever might come. "Home," he agreed, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Not just a place, but a heart to return to. And as night fell over the Montana mountains, the lights of the Galloway Ranch shone warm and steady, a beacon of the truth that even in the wildest places, love could take root and flourish, transforming not just the land but the souls of those who dared to believe in its power.